If you're big into the interesting music theory video essay sphere, you might be familiar with the name Tantacrul. Tantacrul, or Martin Curie, alongside his many accomplishments and accolades, recently released a video titled Notation Must Die, The Battle for How We Read Music. In this video, Tantacrul goes over the history of Western music notation and discusses some of the attempted changes and reforms. I found this video so fascinating that I tracked down one of his sources, Gardner Reed's sourcebook of proposed music notation reforms, for a bit of light reading. So imagine my surprise when one day I receive a notification from Reddit, of all things. I'm not particularly active on there, but I do like to browse the r/composer subreddit, which occasionally plays host to some interesting discussions that I like to read in my downtime. This particular notification came from a post that had been gaining a fair bit of, let's call it traction, recently. Simply titled, The Dumbest Improvement on Staff Notation, by a user called Integer Division. As they put it, the post discusses an epiphany user Integer Division had while writing and playing with music in the grand staff. Both staffs contain ACE in the spaces, and if I remove the bottom line of treble clef and the top line of the bass staff, both would spell ACE in the spaces and on the first three ledger lines of either side. That's it. So, after reading the post and some of the replies, I went, I want to see how this stands up to some of the criteria that different people have set out for music notation reform. So that's what we're going to do today. To start, let's discuss the system itself. As described by the developer, creator person, the system is built off of 4 lines and 3 spaces. This 4-line to 3-space ratio allows a type of cyclical repetition, ensuring the note placement of every octave would be uniform. However, it does require additional clefs, one above the treble clef and one below the bass clef, which the designer did take the time to mock up, as well as changing the design for the C clef to focus now more being centered on spaces rather than a line. There was a bit of debate on these threads, however, as to how effective these clefs would be, especially when you look at the standard of modern clefs, which typically circle the line or space that they point to. For example, treble clef, the G clef, circles the G line where the G note is placed, and that's how you know where the G note is placed. Critics of the system bring up the point that these D clefs and B clefs that were proposed could confusingly point to the A or C space if you work off of the system where it is, in fact, cycling around the space or line that it's supposed to represent. All in all, in my opinion, it's a rather simple system. So let's move on to some more objective criteria to help analyze it. In Gardner Reed's sourcebook, he references 2 different systems for analyzing proposed notation reforms, one from a man named Joseph Raimondi, and one from a man named Erhard Karkoschka. The first, from Joseph Raimondi, has 10 different criteria. 1. To make clearer the function of the staff line and spaces. 2. To obviate the need for ledger lines, thus keeping all the notes on the staff. 3. To make all octaves have the same relationship to the staff. 4. To abolish the profusion of clef signs. 5. To simplify or abolish the accidental signs. 6. To improve the visual aspects of duration. 7. To regulate the indications of measure. 8. To improve the notation of irregular rhythmic values. 9. To facilitate the writing down of music. And 10. To make musical typography easier to print and read. Going point by point. Number 1. To make clear the function of the staff lines and spaces. Going off the argument of the creator, I can see the ACE staff getting this point. Notes in the system are universally regulated to the same distinction of line or space across all octaves, something that is not true of modern Western notation. 2. To obviate the need for ledger lines, thus keeping all notes in the staff. To be honest, I am rather conflicted on this point, because you can, yes, keep all notes on the staff with a large number of clef switches. However, if you don't use a large number of clefs, you will not have obviated the need for ledger lines. I do think I'll give the system this point, but I will discuss further in point number 4 why that is. 3. To make all octaves have the same relationship to the staff. Yeah, A+, that's the whole system. That's what it does. Yep, can't not get that point. That's the whole thing. 4. To abolish the profusion of clef signs. So the reason I gave point number 2, to obviate the need for ledger lines, is because I will not be giving this point. In order to obviate the need for ledger lines, you have increased the proliferation of clef signs. There are now 2 more in addition to the ones that typically people would learn. However, if you get rid of these extra clef signs, even more ledger lines are necessary. So in my opinion, you have to either give 0.2 or 0.4 depending on how you're going to use the system. And since the addition of clefs was a purposeful point on the part of the creator of the system, I've decided that I will not be giving 0.4 because they are adding more clefs to reduce the need for ledger lines. Now, points 5, 6, 7, and 8 are interesting because the system doesn't really interact with those at all. You know, it's more about simplifying the ease of reading notes where they're placed, and thus doesn't touch on rhythm duration or visual complexity at all, other than to simplify the placement of notes in the octave. So I can't really give it those points because it doesn't interact with them at all. So yeah. No points for 5, 6, 7, or 8. But I think that'll be fine because 9 and 10 are going to take a little while to discuss. 9. To facilitate the writing down of music. Coming from the perspective of an instrumentalist, a composer, and someone who just frequently edits sheet music, I have to say I don't believe that this system facilitates easier writing of music when dealing with anything bigger than about 2.5 octaves. Depending on which clef you start in, you would frequently need to change clefs just to stay in the staff, or be quickly bogged down in the increased number of ledger lines you have to use. As a bass clarinetist, I frequently spend a fair amount of a piece in the basement of my range, written C3 to written C4, which could be written in either the bass clef or the C clef. For ease of use, let's say I wrote it in the C clef. Later comes a part in the song where I'm forced to play in my throat tones, written C4, written C5. That would be a switch, again, either to the C clef or the treble clef. That's great, but in higher level repertoire, I also frequently play in the upper altissimo register, written C5, C6, and C7 range. So again, I would be spanning the whistle clef that he's added above that, and the treble clef still. For advanced solo repertoire in basically any instrument where you're playing with over a range of 2.5 octaves, you'll be switching these clefs constantly. All these changes in clefs, or just an increased use of ledger lines. Neither seems to make writing music any easier on some level. We already have to do that for some instruments. Take bassoon repertoire, trombone repertoire, hell, even bass clarinet repertoire in the German tradition. So because it doesn't actually improve on the difficulty of writing down music, nor does it make it any harder, in my opinion, I'll give it a half a point for striking a nice middle ground. Point number 10. To make musical typography easier to print and read. Now, because these points were written in the 1800s, I do want to kind of ignore the part of it where it's easier to print, because with the power of software and home printers, these days it's very easy to print basically anything. So I don't really want to push on the point that it's easier to print. Easier to read, however, I feel is very subjective. For me, having studied traditional Western music notation for the entire time I've been learning music, it's rather hard to adapt to these systems that are so close to traditional Western notation, because I'll probably just revert back. I try to revert back to what I know in those systems. And I think this is put best by user Sestaro, as they say. As a personal aside, as a horn player who often switches clefs in the same piece, I think having the clef symmetrical at the octave would make things a little more complicated. Not less. It's difficult to explain, but the pitch patterns and placement of accidentals just look different in treble/bass clefs. It's usually pretty easy to tell which passages are in treble versus bass without having to check the clef. In the ACE system, I feel like I would have to constantly ask myself, which clef range am I supposed to be in? Which would be a disaster when sight reading. Personally, I feel that comment makes a fair amount of sense, and that argument makes quite a lot of sense. So I am not inclined to give the ACE staff this point. To sum up the analysis using Raimondi's criteria, the system scores an honestly not terrible score of 3.5 out of 10, which I realize doesn't sound great, but then when you consider the fact that it really only interacts with 6 points out of the 10, that's better than 50%. Erhard Karkoschka's points of criteria differ quite a bit from Raimondi's 10, which is to be expected, seeing as Karkoschka wrote his about 110 years later. The 8 points are, it should possess all the possibilities of traditional notation. It should not go against tradition without good reason. It should have enough new technical possibilities to be able to represent the present stage of musical thinking. It should be capable of presenting complicated structures in a simpler form than does present-day notation. It should have a broad, neutral basis and avoid, if possible, representing any particular style. It should make easier the transition to individual notation forms, for example, approximate values and musical graphics. 7. It should have no difficulty in being able to represent more than 12 values, intervals, in an octave. And 8. What the ear hears must be presented to the eye in such a way that two basic characteristics are taken into consideration. The visual event must be as apparent as the direct translation of the auditory event, requiring as few additional thought processes as possible, and B, the individual symbols and the totality of symbols must be formed on an optical basis. They must be correct in the visual psychological sense. Again, let's go point by point here. Point number 1, it should possess all the possibilities of traditional notation. I would say, yes, the system does include all of the possibilities of traditional notation, in the sense that it isn't overly far removed from it. 2, it should not go against tradition without good reason. I do feel that this point, again, is one of those little subjective ones. As I discussed earlier, there are drawbacks to uniformity when dealing with a system like this. But, harkening back to point 3 from the previous system of analysis, there are people who want that kind of thing in their music notation systems. I can take the argument that the creator of the ACE staff thinks that their reason is a good one, and from reading the replies to them, there are more than a few people who agree. So I will be giving this system this point. Point 3. It should have enough new technical possibilities to be able to represent the present stage of musical thinking. Here's where the system starts to show some issues in this analysis. Being so closely related to Western tradition as it stands today, and possessing all of the possibilities of traditional Western notation, it doesn't really add anything new to the mix. Because of its similarity to how things stand today, I honestly can't think of anything additional that would be possible using this notation system that would just not be possible in modern Western notation. So I will not be giving it this point. Number 4. It should be capable of presenting complicated structures in a simpler form than does present-day notation. Here I think your idea of a complicated structure is important. If you find it difficult to read chords in different clefs, then yes, this does a better job of presenting complicated structures. However, this isn't any more adept at showing complexities in rhythms, such as nested tuplets or polyrhythms, nor does it change showing complex harmonies all that much, so I'm not inclined to award this point. Point number 5. It should have a broad, neutral basis and avoid, if possible, representing any particular style. If I had to make an argument about this point, and I do because I chose the frame of analysis, so I would have to say that there is a bias against writing that relies heavily on immense ranges. Distinguishing between the octave placement of notes can be a bit difficult without relying on the clef constantly, especially if you frequently change those clefs over the course of a piece. Personally, as a bass clarinetist, I have around a 4-octave fully chromatic range, and that spans around 4.5 clefs, especially in most of the solo reading I read these days. I am also, at this point in writing the script and recording the video, a little confused about how multiple staff instruments would work, like the piano or the organ. I'm not entirely certain how that would work. So, yeah. Not awarding point number 5. Point number 6. It should make easier the transition to individual notation forms. For example, approximate values and musical graphics. Again, I think that the similarity to Western notation really bogs this down. I don't think it's any easier or harder to display these types of non-standard notations than it is with typical Western notation. So, again, no point here. 7. It should have no difficulty in being able to represent more than 12 values, intervals, in an octave. To use the same argument about similarity to Western traditional notation, I do think that this point should actually be awarded, and it should be possible to do this. While I'm not very familiar with anything beyond 24-tone equal temperament, I know that modern Western notation can display it through the use of accidentals rather well, all things considered, and I imagine this system would do much the same. 8. What the ear hears must be presented to the eye in such a way that two basic characteristics are taken into consideration. A. The visual event must be as apparent as the direct translation of the auditory event, requiring as few additional thought processes as possible. And B. The individual symbols and the totality of the symbols must be formed on an optical basis. They must be correct in the visual psychological sense. To go back to the same argument, in comparison to modern standard of Western musical notation, it performs in the exact same way, especially due to its immense similarity. Based on that, and because it was a really long point to read and I want to keep this video concise, I will be awarding the ACE staff this point. So by doing an analysis of the Karkoshka's criteria, we can see that the ACE staff performs, I think, rather admirably with a score of 4 out of 8. So, when looking at both sets of criteria that we discussed, the ACE staff scores around a 50% on all of the points it interacts with. But for my own opinion, I want to be a little more subjective and a little less objective list of criteria. When you're reading this, there was a lot of backlash that just kind of comes across as, but this isn't how it works! Exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point 1, exclamation point 1. Or, clearly you don't understand exactly 500 years of evolution through the influence of thousands of composers and musicians directly creating Western modern music notation, and that is obviously the only correct way to do things because of that. So your idea is stupid and wrong, and you're going to ruin children's lives if you use this as a teaching tool. But there is a point being made in these threads that I would like to echo. I think user Dave the Composer said it best in one of his comments. Man, there's more than a little stick in the mudness going on here. Obviously, your idea isn't going to take off anytime soon. But that doesn't mean that your idea is without merit in a hypothetical sense, or at least something interesting to think about that engages our imaginations along with thinking rationally on the topic. Who wins in a fight between Batman and a Jedi? Fun to think about. See, I like his point that, well, we all know this isn't going to be some big revolutionary idea that changes the face of music as we know it, and changes the system of notation we've been using for hundreds of years in a single day. I think it's important to be fair to the idea, and entertain that it has some merit, even if it's just as a hypothetical, or if it's as an exercise or teaching tool. We should, in my opinion, be encouraging further experimentation and exploration of these concepts, rather than just shutting them down with dismissive or rather mean-spirited comebacks. In recent times, I've been exploring myself how different notation systems can best get across different concepts in my writing. And as I've done this work, I've really moved past the idea that standard Western notation has to be the end-all be-all. To sum up that lengthy idea, and to stop myself from rambling further on about my own work, I want to say that, while this isn't revolutionary, it's not going to change the face of the world, it doesn't check off every box on a tick list that's older than my grandparents combined, I still think that there's plenty of merit to this idea, and we should be encouraging more thought and rational, kind discussion on it than just shutting it down. Thanks for watching. If you've made it this far, feel free to stick around the channel by subscribing or checking out some of my other videos. Or, feel free to go into the comment section and leave me your opinion on the ACE staff. I'd love to hear what you guys think. I'm hoping to try out some new types of content this year, and as the year goes on, and I think that this is a strong start, and I found this fascinating to talk about, and I hope you guys enjoy. So, yeah, that's all. Thanks. I'll see you next time.